Hi, I'm Britt Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall.
Welcome back after a short festive season break to Season 4 of Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future.
This is where we offer you an inside look at the less well-known spaces where the science and policy of biodiversity meet, with unique perspectives from those on the front lines of research and action for nature.
Today, we're talking ugly. And that doesn't mean that Britt and I are going to be bad-mouthing each other. What it means is we're going to be inviting you to join us in talking about some species that, at first glance, won't win any beauty contests.
Now look, I do not need to be convinced here. Sharks are my favorite animal and have been forever. And I've been told that they're not adorable to everyone, which I don't understand. But tell me, Rob, if you had to pick a species, what's your favorite, let's say, mammal?
I am a big fan of meerkats. So being from Southern Africa, it's kind of a cultural thing, but also they're incredibly social animals. They spend a lot of time communicating, and they really play an important role in the health of their ecosystems as well.
Yeah, but let's also be fair. They are stupidly adorable, like incredibly photogenic. These are things that we could watch all day and make us smile, right? And I think that's the thing. You know, it's a great setup for discussing animals that aren't as well known or might be a little less adorable, you know?
Yeah.
Like the naked mole rat, proboscis monkey, the eye, one of my favorite weirdos.
Well, you're exactly right, Britt. Ugly species don't get the attention they sometimes badly need just because they're not as cute as the panda or as imposing as the elephant or as majestic as the lion.
And, I mean, this has real implications for these non-celebrity species, right?
It absolutely does. These value judgments that we make, our beauty bias, if you want, has some very negative impacts in very practical ways, including less availability of data, less research into these species, and much less funding for conservation of these less appealing species. And that often raises their risk of extinction. But there is one person who is attempting to raise the profile of ugly species through a tremendously powerful weapon, and that is humor. So Simon Watt is probably one of the very few people who manages to combine being an evolutionary biologist and a stand-up comedian at the same time. Simon's also an author, a TV presenter, and the founder as well as lifetime chair of the beautifully named Ugly Animal Preservation Society. So in between all of his various activities, I was lucky enough to catch up with Simon, who began telling me about the society and its decision to choose the blobfish, especially the very famous example of this species called Mr. Blobby, as the world's ugliest animal.
The blobfish is a deep-sea fish with a certain gelatinous quality. I think the comedian Robin Ince described it very well. He says it looks like the final day in the closing down sale of a candle shop. And it's kind of notorious for various reasons. One is that there's an image of it which was taken of a dead one, so of course it doesn't look exactly its best. But it is officially the ugliest animal in the world. The reason why it's official is because 11 years ago now, I set up the Ugly Animal Preservation Society and we had an online poll.
And I'm pleased to announce that the mascot for the Ugly Animal Preservation Society is the blobfish,
which resulted in it being elected as the ugliest animal in the world.
Well, you created the Ugly Animal Preservation Society initially as both a comedy act and a conservation awareness initiative to campaign on some of nature's really neglected stepchildren. Most biologists tend to focus on charismatic species. What made you buck the trend in your field?
I kind of thought that whenever everything was so bad for nature, like when we see the crisis which is facing biodiversity loss and climate change and that kind of thing, that sincerity shouldn't be our only weapon. So I wanted to make sure we could do something which would be complementary. So there was a couple of things which led to it. One was a genuine love. So I love stand-up. Like, I think it is a beautiful art form and one of the last public forums for philosophy and discussion in some ways. And I love nature and I love biology and I love my subject. So it was only natural that my passions tended to bleed together.
You're using stand-up to stand up for nature, are you?
Yeah, well, what I really thought I was doing was taking the laws of satire and applying them to conservation, because I think we make jokes about politics because politics matters. So I thought we should make jokes about conservation because conservation matters. So specifically, I wanted to talk to adults because I wanted them to be people who could vote and could try and change the world. And the other side of it is just simple grief fatigue. I mean, if you're interested in conservation, you're basically opening the newspaper to see what's died today. So I was trying to figure out what was another way of talking about these things. And a stand-up comedy night seemed to be it.
Please give a warm round of applause for your host and president for life of the Ugly Animal Preservation Society, Simon Watt.
Hello! Are you ready for some science-based comedy fun?
So there's a couple of different types now. One of them is that, sure enough, we do have shows that go into schools and like kids' festivals and stuff. But the original, and to my mind, the best and the one I love the most, are our adults-only comedy nights. Which also makes sense with biology, because I've always thought that biology is very much the sort of Quentin Tarantino movie of the sciences. It is all sex and death. But I MC, like that is my job, that is my role as president for life of the Ugly Animal Society, which is a pun that nobody ever gets, really. And then we get maybe 5-6 comedians, and they've got like 10 minutes each to talk about an ugly endangered species.
Does anybody here know what the second ugliest animal in the world is? A kakapo. Who said that? You see, we're going to be friends. This is a good sign. Yeah, you're welcome. This is a kakapo. It's the world's only flightless parrot. Ergo, it's a rubbish parrot.
Now, the depth that they go into varies massively. My friend Elf Lyons was just, oh God, Simon, I'm so pleased to meet you at last. Somebody at last giving me an excuse to talk about sharks. Because she's got a genuine passion there. Like, all approaches are valid. So it has to be funny first. Like, that's the cultural side of it. So, we have 5-6 acts, 10 minutes each. We maybe have some games during the interval where people can try and come up with, like, appropriate names for these Latin species based on how they look. And then at the end, we have a vote. And then that becomes the mascot for the town. So, for instance, Edinburgh is the gob-faced squid, a creature that's so rare it didn't even have a common name until we named it, and now it's in Wikipedia, so that must be true. London's the proboscis monkey. Bruges is the pig-nosed purple frog. And this meant that really I was getting people to hear about 5, 6, 7 plus endangered species and leaving kind of happy, I hope, and doing it for 2 hours without switching off.
Blobfish, from what I've been able to tell, don't look very much like the image that we know of Mr. Blobby. Do you ever feel like you perhaps brought too much attention or negative attention to Blobfish and the poor Mr. Blobby himself?
There's a couple of things which happened here, which means that you might be onto something. The first one was that genuinely, maybe a few weeks after the campaign, I got hate mail from a bunch of 4-year-olds. And the reason is because there was a teacher in the US who decided to turn moderate harassment into a class project and got her kids to write me letters complaining I was bullying the blobfish. The one good thing about getting hate mail from 4-year-olds is that they still sign it with love, which I found really funny. But it was also because they thought I was bullying, and they thought you shouldn't call anything ugly. Anyway, getting back to it, you're right. In the wild, they are not as ugly. But by talking about the blobfish, we're able to talk about the kind of pressures facing all the deep-sea fish. You know, everything from deep-sea trawling to pollution to strip mining of the ocean floor. And it's also just a way of introducing more characters. Until we came along, the blobfish was relatively unknown, and now I love going into a school and seeing how many of them have heard of it.
Well, I mean, within the human kingdom, of course, and within the human species, we have different standards of beauty, and beauty tends to be quite culturally defined. What are the kinds of traits that we humans tend to find more beautiful in other species, and what kinds are less appealing to us?
Part of human nature is that we see the entire universe as a mirror. Whenever you think about the things that we find cute and cuddly, and generally it's mammals, it's things which have been lucky enough to have a face. But of course, mammals are the minority. And the vast majority of life out there, for the animals at least, is the invertebrates. And it's tiny things that are sort of so small we can't relate to them. So the charismatic megafauna, as we call them, your big or your majestic or your cute things, get all the attention while these other species are neglected. And it's not just a cultural thing, we know it's also true of science. So if you are a tiger or something with that majesty, you're way more likely to be researched than a dung beetle.
Does it go beyond visual appearance? What about things like behavior and smells and sounds?
Yes, the invertebrates don't have a look in for this. So the things which feed on corpses and carcasses and like detritus are way overlooked.
I suppose it also, to a degree, explains plant blindness and fungi blindness and sort of the focus on animal species particularly.
Yeah, I would love to have an ugly plant competition. If anyone out there wants to take part, let me know. That goes to show the real favoritism. We like things that move.
Given the lack of funding that's available generally for conservation, I know there's some different ways of approaching how conservation organizations choose what species they're going to focus on. I know there's one approach that's quite data-driven. It looks at trying to calculate what are the costs going to be to recover a species compared to the likelihood of its extinction. I know there's another approach that looks at how unique species are. And then there's an approach which is focusing on ecosystems rather than species. Given the fact that we know more about the charismatic species, is there a danger in some of these approaches that are data-driven in terms of making decisions on things that we don't know?
Yes, there's bound to be a bias which is inherent to all of our stuff, but it is still better to be at least a little bit informed than completely uninformed. And also, if we're aware of the biases we have, then we can try and do a little bit towards correcting them. Fundamentally, this is a thing which I think I have to be careful on, particularly bearing in mind that part of my shtick is I end up saying very rude things about lots of the very cute and cuddly animals. I've said some really nasty things about pandas in the past.
So I set up the society. It was all because of these pandas. I hate pandas.
And that is partly because I know I can completely get away with it. No matter how insulting I am, there's no way I'm going to put a dent in its popularity.
Your popularity, on the other hand.
Oh, my popularity. Oh, it's suffered enough. Crikey. But it means that, I suppose, by trying to broaden the conversation, we can at least try and think about things more analytically. You're talking there about data-driven approaches as if that's actually how the majority of the world makes any form of decision. And it might be good that the people who are powerful, the people who have the knowledge and the know-how to try and change are data-driven. But I don't think that's true for the majority. So I think it is one of those important things to try and just get more people enthused and talking about these things, to give them permission to take part and permission to care.
Apart from humor, how else do we go about changing this kind of behavior?
One of them is that local thing of giving people whatever their connection might be. There's some people who are doing some fantastic work in India on things like vultures and these birds which were once seen as very taboo, to give people a local pride in them. The people who will have some kind of emotional bond, then again, they're already on our team. So the first thing is to try and just get more people into the fold. And one of the things not to be overlooked is the analytical. As my wife will tell you and complain, I'm not a very emotional person. A lot of my stuff is appealing to my reason and my judgment rather than this. And I think that actually that reasoning of it's important because rather than we know it's all important is a thing which is worthwhile acknowledging. Will get people on board.
What are some of the lessons that you've learned about marketing for conservation purposes, marketing these relatively unmarketable animals?
One of the things, and maybe actually I should have said this at the very start, we're not a real society. Get that out of your head. We exist entirely to take the mickey. And that is partly because there are great people out there doing the real work that I didn't want to take anything from. Talking the way I do does mean I can talk about things like the EDGE campaign, who look at evolutionary distinct, globally endangered. A lot of the ugly animals are featured on their lists. I can talk about the habitat approaches. I can talk about people like the World Land Trust who take that kind of approach. So there's other people doing good things elsewhere that we can point to. Everything becomes a chance for a story. And the actual getting a mascot thing does mean that every town that we go to ends up having something memorable. And it can become an excuse for a press release. So the first gig we ever did in non-English was in Bulgaria. And they elected the griffon vulture as their ugly animal mascot. Now, it's not endangered, but it's locally endangered out there. And the next morning, the local griffon vulture charity got on their equivalent of the breakfast sofa. They were on all the news. And they got loads more press than they'd ever had. So it's that other people can hop onto it. The other side of our gigs is that we're taking culture seriously, I suppose. So as well as it becoming an excuse for a press release to talk about these animals, it was also a way of meaning that people will be reading a conservation message in the review section of the newspaper or the website or whatever, as well as in the news. So it was putting it somewhere else.
Rob, I just adore getting to hear another science nerd who loves performance. Gotta love it.
We're few and far between, but it's great when we find each other.
Right, it's just a delight. And thinking about what he said, that when it comes to conservation, sincerity, seriousness shouldn't be our only tool in the toolbox. Sure, like laughing about these things is hard, but laughing and making jokes is something we should do because it matters and gets us to think and feel about the topic in a different way.
It absolutely does. And it also does, as Simon talked about, it helps to counter some of the grief fatigue, this constant flow of bad news about nature and the environment and the impacts that has on people. So if it's a question of having to either laugh or cry, if you can laugh and still make a difference, why not?
Oh, totally. And this sort of art form is also doing a lot of education. I mean, this is amazing science communication, getting people to think about and pay attention to lesser considered species or things we haven't heard of.
I think one of my favorite moments from the whole interview was when Simon shared with us the experience of receiving hate mail from 4-year-olds. Signed with love.
So good.
It really puts such a spin and a perspective on the passion that people feel for any kinds of species and all kinds of species, and the extent to which even kids, really young kids, are so invested in making a point about wanting to save and appreciate and value animals of all kinds.
Oh, 100%. I think that speaks to learned values as well. If you're introduced to something as this cool, weird new friend versus ew, gross, step back, completely different situation. And yeah, 4-year-olds, very good judgment as far as just wanting to love. And how about we not bully that sweet little man?
There's also a middle ground between the species that are considered by many people to be ugly and the celebrity species that we're so familiar with. And in the conservation circles, this has become known as the Cinderella species. These are ones that might perhaps still be relatively aesthetically pleasing, but they're still overlooked. And the phrase was coined by Bob Smith, who is a professor in conservation science and director at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent in the UK. He's done extensive research on which are the favoured, the ugly, and the Cinderella species, and what this means really in practice for these creatures. Bob told me how he'd gone about doing some of this work.
We went through all the largish mammals globally and looked at what conservation organisations were using, which of those species they were using to fundraise, and showed quite clearly that the popular species were the ones that are large because people are sort of in awe of those bigger species, and also ones that had forward-facing eyes. So ones where their faces are more like human faces. And just by coming up with a little equation that captured that, we could calculate for every other species how appealing it was likely to be to the public. And we identified a whole set of those sort of not quite as big, but still appealing species. When we did the analysis, it was striking how international conservation organisations were really using quite a narrow set of those species. Things like tigers and elephants and rhinos and great apes came up over and over again. And we suggested actually you could broaden the list of species that you're using and still have ones that would appeal to the general public.
Can you give us an example of what might be a Cinderella species?
The thing we found is that there are actually probably hundreds. So one of the species that we came up with is the African wild ass, which is the sort of relative of the donkey that's found in North Africa. Looks very like a donkey, but sort of more slender and more silvery. But, at the moment, partly possibly because of its name, it's largely ignored. We also had the tamarau, which is a species of medium-sized cow that's found in the Philippines, often ignored. Although actually, from that analysis, it's been nice that some of those species have actually been picked up on. And then we had a species of monkey, the Pennant's colobus monkey. And then finally, the one we highlighted in the paper was the pygmy raccoon, which looks pretty similar to a raccoon, but is obviously smaller. And because it's got a much smaller range, it's critically endangered.
Are there any real-world examples of the needs of celebrity species that might perhaps be in opposition to the needs of some of the less charismatic species, and focusing on charismatic species might perhaps impact the survival of the less charismatic species?
Yes, I think in terms of fundraising, it's less of an issue. It's more that because those species are the celebrities, they do get treated differently as sort of part of day-to-day management. So, I mean, a nice example is elephants in southern Africa, the famous example being Kruger National Park. It's changed now, but for decades, that park was managed to maintain the elephant numbers, and elephants are water-restricted species. So because of that, they built water holes across the whole of the protected area, which meant that elephants could go everywhere and impacted on the vegetation. And so a set of species that didn't need water and were found in habitats that weren't impacted by elephants really declined. If you look at the biodiversity in similar habitats in Eswatini, the country next door to Kruger National Park, you could argue that there's a set of species there that are missing from Kruger because of the impacts of elephants over that whole landscape.
I remember some of the photographs, some of the aerial photographs from Kruger National Park, which were taken time-lapse, I think, from the 1970s through to the 1990s, showing the tree cover and the amount of trees that had been denuded and devastated by the impacts of the elephants. You could totally imagine that change of the environment and change of the ecosystems would have impacted many other species living there.
Yes, completely. I mean, what elephants do is also an incredibly important ecological process. So the way that they maintain the grasslands, their interactions with the savannas are absolutely key. But if you're managing a site so that they can just do that everywhere, then yeah, that's likely to have negative impacts.
I know there have been cases where, again, through the use of some of these celebrity species, funding has been raised and invested to try and conserve specific species. And then sometimes that doesn't work. I mean, you get occasions where all of this money has been raised and invested and species continue to decline despite that. Do you buy the argument that this is perhaps another problem of charismatic species, the idea that we're somehow using up the available pot of money for species conservation?
Not really. I mean, to a small extent, but the idea that there's just one pot of money and that if it's not spent on exactly the best things, then it's a waste, I think is, obviously not true. All the debates about de-extinction and people talk about, well, that's a waste of money and it would be much better spent somewhere else. But I'm not convinced that people interested in de-extinction, so bringing back woolly mammoths or dodos, would be spending their money on something else. And similarly, I think one of the nice things about marketing is that you realise value is not a fixed thing. When I was little, axolotls were just seen as odd, weird.
My daughter can't get enough of them now.
Yeah, so those first photos that sort of had them, photos taken head on where they've got their sort of beatific smiles, and then the fact that they're now fully in popular culture is amazing. So yeah, that's a nice example of something that was seen when I was a boy as a sort of weird, slimy, ugly thing, as now being incredibly popular.
Some of the work that I've read that is attributed to you really brings across this idea that I think you operate from a place of optimism. You said in that piece that I read, it's our job as conservationists to inspire people to love other species too. So what actions would you recommend to our listeners to inspire that kind of love and optimism for a wider range of species, or all species?
A key part of it is just sort of getting on with it rather than complaining, get marketing. So I think it's a case of choosing the species that you love and start thinking about the innovative ways that you can raise their profile. I mean, I slightly get in trouble with my botanical friends, but lots of plant conservation people talk about plant blindness, and they talk about this being a big barrier towards plant conservation because people don't notice plants and birds and mammals get all the funding. But in terms of television in the UK, there are literally hours of programs dedicated to plants, gardening, but even so, it shows the incredible interest there is in plants. And then also you have a whole set of incredible species that are orchids, rainforest trees. There's a whole set of really cool plants out there. And if you just sit there going, it's not fair, people keep on giving tigers money, then yeah, that's not going to change. The less glamorous ones, the ugly ones, definitely take more effort. But again, we've shown from previous work that if you raise the profile of even species like bats that aren't terribly appealing, if you focus on what makes them interesting, if you focus on the fact that they're endangered and that they need help, if you can create stories around them, then there's definitely scope for making a difference.
The example of elephants and Kruger as these celebrity species, getting all this attention, we've added water holes, they've expanded range. The fact that that then has impacts and affects other species, usually not intentionally, really stuck with me.
Having been to Kruger a number of times myself, being from South Africa, it really does resonate, because in many ways, the way in which the elephants are treated and the way in which they're given this celebrity status and the way that they've been looked after, it really has terraformed the Kruger National Park and many other parks like that.
Oh, big time. And then once you've done that, the question is, do you continue along that track? Is that where you're putting all the funding? Is it possible that competition for attention doesn't actually affect resources and funding? What do you think about that, the resources question?
I'm not entirely sure, because to be honest, I take the point about de-extinction and money being spent on de-extinction perhaps might not be spent necessarily on conservation, but I do think there is a limited pot, a limited appetite that funders and that the general public have as to how much they're willing to actually invest and spend on conservation and on nature. And another limitation is attention and willingness to actually engage. How many species are you willing to get passionate about? One that always springs to mind, and it was mentioned in the interview as well, was the axolotl. Now, my daughter is a huge Minecraft fan, and for her, the axolotl and the llama are some of the most familiar and loved species because she literally creates them. She builds them in the game. Now, in my youth, the axolotl was an unknown, or at the very least, a very little known creature. So it really does show how our values change over time, and perhaps our attention span for which species we're engaged with change as well.
Storytelling is key. I love that you brought up Minecraft and that engagement through creation. I'm fascinated by the non-human animal characters that youth and young people are exposed to within popular media, these blockbuster sort of children's films that come out. Like, who are our characters? Usually non-human animals. Even think about fairy tales or, Aesop's fables, these small things we grow up with learning, and it's different for every culture, but a lot of times non-human animals are part of it, and that becomes a kind of entry point to then knowing and thinking about these individuals.
And even the portrayal of non-animal characters, vegetative characters. I'm thinking about Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy, for instance. Groot is portrayed as bipedal and essentially almost human in character, except with bark for a skin. Plant blindness and this idea that we talked about, that there's a degree of unwillingness to consider even plants or fungi or other types of creatures apart from animals, even extends to the portrayal of those non-animal species.
Oh, totally. I mean, I love the Groot example. It's like, okay, well, if I'm gonna connect to this, it should probably walk on two legs.
And have a face.
Yeah, totally reasonable. And even the idea of invertebrates, right? We had Bug's Life and ants. Like, we've had these characters actually, and that's kind of exciting, For everything that we think is lost, there are these little stories that feature them as characters.
When you can tell stories, and when you can tell engaging stories about species that are perhaps less well-known or less charismatic, if you can find their unique points, their selling points, what's cool about them, what's different about them, it really helps you to promote the idea of their beauty, seen from a different lens.
Totally. And I appreciate you bringing us these stories today. So let's keep on storytelling. What do you say?
It's a deal. That's it for this episode of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future, with me, Rob Spall.
And me, Britt Garner. In our next episode, we're going to shift our focus from underappreciated species to underrepresented regions in the efforts to strengthen biodiversity science for better informed policies and action.
And in the meantime, you can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of our social media channels. Just search for @IPBES. That's @IPBES. Thanks for listening.